The Ballad of Barovia, a Curse of Strahd novel by the Were-Raven Bard. Prologue. I walked into the Blue Water Inn, and the room fell dead quiet. The cold night air swept in after me, and Lady Voctor shivered. I would have been surprised to see her here, an establishment she had always considered too low-brow for a woman of her breeding. But nothing could surprise me any more. The creaking of the wooden floor under my muddy boots and the patter of rain on the windows were the only noises as I walked to the bar. The Vistana woman behind the counter eyed me warily. It was strange not seeing my brother behind that bar. I could tell she wanted to ask me the question. They all did. But it was Muriel Vinshaw who spoke. "Well?" Muriel's voice was strained. "Is the devil? Is he?" But she could not bring herself to finish the sentence. I looked at the Vistana woman. "I'd like a glass of Red Dragon Crush." She uncorked the wine bottle and poured it with shaking hands. I took the glass, not bothering to pay. I swirled the red liquid in my hand and remembered how much blood had been spilt. I took a sip, set my drink down, and pulled out the lute from under my cloak. I strummed a chord. "Damn it, Elvire!" Muriel slammed her hand on the table. "Now is not the time for one of your songs. We all know they went to the castle. We all know you and your father were there. Tell us plainly what happened." At that moment I should have played a ballad. I should have sung a requiem of such bitter sorrow that everyone in the room would have wept until their dying days. For a ballad would be the only way to do the story justice. Instead, I told them plainly. But for you, dear reader, I will write, and I warn you that reading what I have to say may not be pleasant for those of a gentle disposition. After all, I would not wish that any should endure such evils. I witnessed only some of the events I now relate, but I knew the heroes of this tale personally, and it is my hope that you will hear their voices speaking through these pages. While many contributed their own perspectives during or after the events described, the notes I recovered from Navara's journal have provided my story with its richest source of detail. If my story seems of little consequence, it is only due to the weakness of my own pen, but I assure you of its importance to the hapless people of Borovia. To them it has meant nothing less than the difference between life and death. All at once, every candle in the house went out. Ireena's heart pounded, and her eyes widened with panic. She looked at her brother, now barely visible in the moonlight that crept in from the windows. "Ismark, he's back," she said. Ismark stumbled through the darkness to the mantel and grabbed the two swords that hung above the fireplace. Ireena took one in trembling hands. A rustling sounded in the empty hearth, and Ireena pointed her weapon toward it. She held her breath, listening. All was silent. Then footsteps ran down the stairs, and soon her father was standing beside her. "Ireena, are you all right?" Kolyan asked. Ireena nodded yes, but her frightened eyes betrayed the truth. She was far from all right, and they all knew it. "Ivan!" Kolyan called. "Ivan!" A moment later a servant came into the room. He wielded a garlic bulb as though it were a club. "Ivan, take this letter." Kolyan pulled an envelope from his vest. "Take it to the gate, all the way to the edge of the mist. Find help." "But, Burgomaster, you know I won't make it through the mist." Kolyan pushed the letter into the servant's chest. "We have no choice. Now go!" Ivan took it, and without another word fled out the back door. "Father," Ismark said, "we need to get Ireena out of here." Yes, but first... Scratching and squeaking issued from the fireplace, cutting him off. Soot fell from the chimney into the grate. Then bats burst forth in a swarm, screeching and flapping, engulfing the room in a black maelstrom. Ireena and Ismark swung their swords wildly, but it did little to thin the raging tempest. The bats gave a high-pitched shriek, then fled, smashing through the glass windows and bursting through the front door into the night. When the sound of wings had gone, the silhouette of a well-dressed man appeared in the open doorway. There was no shadow, no dark of night that could hide his pale face from the light of the full moon. A hungry smile curled across his lips. His red eyes, so thirsty, fixed themselves on Ireena. "Good evening, Burgomaster," said the man with an educated air. "I have come to call on your daughter." Chapter 1. The Grinning Goblin. Sunlight streamed into the room. It was warm and bright, and Navara couldn't help but smile. She was going to do it. She was going to rescue Gostamere. She opened the window and looked out on the tranquil village street. A few people down below walked here and there, going about their daily routines. "Good morning," she said to no one in particular. She didn't wait to see if anyone noticed, but instead grabbed her few belongings and left the room for the last time. She walked downstairs, past an empty bar and out into the cool air. A breeze from the wharfs greeted her with the familiar smell of salt and fish. "Farewell," she said, looking back at the inn with fondness. "Herkamoid." She turned to the pseudo-dragon perched on her shoulders. "Let's go say goodbye to the sheriff." Her long, wavy hair bobbed as she skipped down Gudrun Street, green highlights dancing among the shades of red. Navara had donned spring this morning, despite the real season. Not that she didn't like autumn. She loved autumn. But as an Eladrin elf, she could take on the aspect of any season that suited her mood. Fall felt giving and loving, cultivating an air of joyful sacrifice. If she were in an autumnal mood, her hair would have a touch of gold, which she thought looked the best. But spring was exciting and full of new beginnings, and this morning she definitely felt spring. Hence a few locks of green. Of course, most days of the year she chose spring, but today was even more springish than usual. When she reached the sheriff's office, she noticed a cluster of blooming blue winter bells. They were early, the first flowers of the season. She bent down and picked one. After putting the petals to her nose and smelling the fragrant aroma, she pressed it between 2 pages of her journal. She wanted to bring something special with her from home, and a winter bell was perfect, since the flowers only grew in Harrington. After stowing the journal back in her rucksack, she walked up the steps of the office and slammed open the door. "Ah, damn!" said a man, shaking spilled drink off his hand. "Navara, I really wish you wouldn't do that." "Good morning, Sheriff," she said, skipping up to him. He set his mug down and tried to wipe the spill from his jerkin. "Do you know what today is?" She lifted her chin. "Another headache." "No." She narrowed her eyes at him. "You have another hangover, don't you?" He ignored her and took a sip from the remains of his drink. Navara leaned in and sniffed his cup. Herkamoid copied, his snout almost touching the liquid. Navara flicked her eyes up to the sheriff and smiled. "That's my remedy. You're finally using it. Is it helping?" He rubbed his temple. "It would be if I hadn't dumped half of it in my lap." His voice was slow and steady, as it always was. "What good is soothing my head if I sear my balls?" Navara was going to miss that voice. It had been 1 year since she became his deputy in Harrington, but it felt longer than that. "You're awfully chipper this morning, Navara." He stopped and scratched his unshaven chin. "I mean, who am I kidding? You're always like this."
"No, you're right. Today is special. Today I'm off to rescue Gostamir."
"Gostamir? You mean that invisible friend of yours?"
Navara nodded. "I'm leaving Harrington, Sheriff."
"Come again?"
His usually placid face was struck by disbelief. "I told you a 10-day ago I would be leaving."
He sat down in the chair behind his desk. "I don't remember that. But Navara, why would you leave? I mean, I've never understood this Gostamir. Maybe it's because I've never talked to him, or seen him. Are you sure he's, real?"
"Oh, Eric, how can you say that? You know Gostamir helped me with so many of our cases. Remember how I was able to save those pixies from the smugglers? There was no possible way I could have talked to them if it wasn't for Gostamir. And remember the werewolf and the orc? You saw how that went down."
"That I will never forget."
"And then there was Ineka."
The sheriff shivered. Don't remind me. Vampires give me the creeps."
"Gostamir helped with all of that too. Besides, Herkomoid has seen him," she said, petting the tiny dragon's scaly neck.
Herkomoid nodded in agreement. "But what do you mean about rescuing him? Rescue him from what?"
"I've tried to explain this to you before, but I'll try again. Gostamir is in the Fey Wild, not in the material plane where we are. When I summon him, I can only see a projection of him. It's not his real body, just an image of it. It's like a visual sending spell."
"A wizard from Borbridge cast a sending spell in my head once. That shit's weird."
"Anyway," Navara continued, "he's trapped in the Fey Wild, and it's up to me to get him out."
"But why now? Hasn't he been talking to you for, years?"
"I'm going now because he's finally remembered where I need to go to rescue him."
Eric raised an eyebrow. Navara pulled out her journal to a spot she had marked and read.
"I need to go to Borovia."
"Never heard of it," said the sheriff flatly. "Is it in the Fey Wild?"
"No, it's in the Shadowfell."
"The what?"
"It's pointless to explain. You'll just forget what I've said by tomorrow. In fact, I've told you this 5 times before. But that's how it is with Barovia. It's cursed. No one can remember it. Not for longer than a day."
"How do you know about it, then?"
"Gostamir. He's been reminding me of it every morning for the past 10 days."
"Your friend who's trapped in the Feywild is telling you to go to Barovia, which is a cursed place in the Shadowfell."
"Wow, Sheriff, I'm impressed you've been able to follow along."
"Navara, how does Gostamir remember this Barovia if you say it's cursed?"
"Oh, once Gostamir remembers something, he doesn't forget. He's a Fey."
"Right."
Navara sighed. "I should go. Hopefully I'll be back before the year is out. But it might be longer."
Then she held out her hand.
"Eric, I consider you a good friend, and I wish the best for you."
The sheriff stood up and shook her hand. A look of confusion and concern etched on his weathered face. "This place won't be the same without you, Deputy. Just stay safe." Navara walked backward toward the door.
"Gostamir assures me there will be plenty of werewolves and hags. My favorites."
A wry grin stole across the sheriff's face. "Well, I suppose you can handle that. Just no pirates, and especially no vampires."
Don't worry. This will be fun.
And with that, she walked out the door. Rowan awoke, cold and alone. She wiped the chilled sweat from her brow. Her nightmares were becoming more frequent. Some of them were of her mother. She would not have minded so much if they were only of her mother, but the torrent of dreams about unfamiliar people and places left her feeling lost. This past dream had two strangers, a dark-eyed warrior and an elf with a dragon. She didn't know who they were, but she saw their faces clearly. She had dreamt about them before. Rowan didn't know if the dreams were prophetic or just a curse on her aimless life. She pulled off her wool blanket and went to gather wood for the fire. She looked around her meagre abode, a cave in a secluded part of the wood. A few mice nestled in a corner of the rag heap she called her bed. She had hoped to find respite here from the noise and confusion of the village below. She told herself she would go back to live among people eventually, but that was months ago. She began to sing a lullaby as she got ready for the day. She thought of her mother as she sang the elven words. She wished things could go back to how they used to be, back to when she was living with her mother and the druids. That was how she had spent the first 50 years of her childhood, and she didn't care that they had been in hiding. She would have gone on hiding and sacrificed her freedom if it meant she could be with her mother again. Nonetheless, her worst fear had come true. Her father had found them, and then he had murdered her mother. Rowan was only thankful she had not witnessed the gruesome deed. Her nightmares were bad enough without that image burned into her memory. But she remembered seeing the blood on his lips and hearing his cold voice admit he had done it. When she had the nerve to ask why, he said, "Because she needed to die," with no other explanation. After that, it was 14 years of miserable imprisonment in her father's wretched tower. If it hadn't been for the monster hunter, Rudolf van Richten, she would still be imprisoned. Now she was free, but alone. She stretched to relieve the tension in her back, but it was no use. Resigning herself to the ache, she left the cave. Her feet crunched brown leaves as she walked along the forest floor. It was only the beginning of autumn, but in this part of the wood many of the trees were almost bare. She gathered a few sticks, enough to make a fire. Her stomach growled, and she realized she needed to cook something more substantial than nuts. Instead of lighting her fire right away, she walked off into the wood. Her strides became long and quick, and soon the patter of 2 elven feet became 4 furry paws. The transformation was effortless. She had done it many times before. Her now long muzzle caught a scent in the air, and she followed it. Her canine ears twitched back and forth among the amplified sounds of the forest. It didn't take long to spot her prey, a white rabbit behind a tall oak. The rabbit was preening its winter coat, for that was just as white as her own. She moved with grace and speed. A chase ensued, but did not last long. Within a few heartbeats, Rowan pinned the small animal, grabbing it by the neck and squeezing until her teeth crunched bone. Warm blood filled her mouth, and the rabbit stopped struggling. She carried it in her jaws back to the cave. Rowan never ate while she was in animal form. She had heard of druids who feasted on raw meat while transformed, but Rowan never wanted to indulge the urge to drink fresh blood. Instead, she set her kill down by the entrance of the cave, threw her head back, and gave a long howl. The sound carried in the stillness of the wood. She transformed back into an elf before skinning and cooking the rabbit. After eating, Rowan decided she would go back to the small village, Blackford. Though she had tried to escape it, that town was often the setting of her dreams. Putting dreams out of her mind, she convinced herself she just needed a change of scenery. She slung her pack over her shoulders, and, as she adjusted the straps, she looked down at the small pool of water that reflected the cave's stalactites. Before leaving her humble dwelling, she leaned over the pool, wishing to see her face looking back. But as always, she saw nothing.
Lords and ladies, yeomen and churls, welcome to Castle Virginia on this momentous day. I, Duke Randall Fitzroy, introduce you to the man, nay, the legend, who has been sent to us by the gods. Here he is, the chosen one, Sir Henry Gibson.
A roar went up from the crowd, and Henry knew that was his cue. He stepped forward and looked out at the thousands who stood below him. His tired eyes were overwhelmed by the sight, and all he wanted was for it to be over. The man who had introduced him tapped Henry on the shoulder, mouthing words at him. "The sword! The sword!" Henry lifted the old sword above his head, and the people cheered even louder. Then a priest approached him. Remembering what was expected, Henry knelt. "By the God of gods," said the priest, "the mighty and eternal Lathander, I anoint you, Sir Henry, to receive this blessing." The priest and his acolytes made a display of preparing the holy oil in a crystal basin. Henry guessed that the mist which poured from the bowl was only for show. The wizened old priest dipped a silver cup into the oil, then slowly poured it over Henry's head, muttering a long-winded prayer. The liquid ran into Henry's thick hair and trickled down his face. "It's almost over," Henry kept thinking. "It's almost over." The ceremony was drawing to a close when Henry heard gasps from the crowd. He opened his eyes and saw a brilliant light radiating from his own hands. Soon his entire body was glowing, and before he had time to speak or even think, he felt something erupt from his back. It wasn't painful, but it scared him all the same. This had not been in the rehearsal. When Henry saw the shock on the priest's face and noticed the acolytes kneeling in awe, he knew this was not their doing either. He turned his head and saw celestial wings, white and feathery, protruding from his shoulder blades. Henry's feet lifted off the ground as he inadvertently flapped the majestic wings like some kind of heavenly spirit. "Holy shit," Henry thought. The people shouted, "Chosen one! Chosen one! Chosen one!" The crowd's echoing chant replayed in Henry's head as he walked to the grinning goblin. The ceremony had happened months ago, and since then the Duke's favor had waned. Henry had never wanted to be the Duke's propaganda piece from the beginning, but ever since Duke Randall realized that the Chosen One's fame was outshining him, Henry had been sent back home to the rustic and insignificant town of Blackford. Henry didn't mind in the least. He only hoped he could fade into obscurity again. "It's him! It's him!" shouted a squeaky girl coming up the lane. This Chosen One business, however, was proving hard to shake. "Sir Henry!" said the young girl in unison with her older sister, mother maybe. "Please, can you bless us, Chosen One?" The older woman clutched her hands together. Henry managed a half-smile. He should be used to the daily deluge of admirers by now, but it still made him tired. Obliging them, he held his hand up in a sign of blessing and mumbled a rote prayer. "Please, can we have a token, a relic?" asked the older woman, eager for more. "Yes, a token, a relic," the girl parroted. Henry was not carrying anything but the shirt on his back and a silver coin for the tavern, and of course he carried his sword. He never went anywhere without it, even if the weapon was the source of his unwanted fame. He looked at the pleading women. Did the girl have tears in her eyes? He pulled a button on his shirt until it popped, then gave it to the weepy girl.
"Thank you," she said, clutching the button in both hands.
After peeling himself away, he made it to the grinning goblin without being accosted by anyone else. It was always a gamble leaving his house. He never knew how many people would recognize him before he could make it to his destination. He walked into the familiar tavern and sat at his usual table by the fireplace. Fagin came over to him.
"Even, Henry," said the proprietor. "I'll bring your soup out in a minute."
"Thanks," Henry said. After the man left, Henry heard wood scraping on wood as someone moved a chair. He turned to see a man getting up to leave. As the man walked out the door, Henry spotted the white cat. "You again," he said to the cat. "You're a sneaky little thing, aren't you, Whiskers?" When Fagin brought his meal, the cat hid under a chair and did not come back out until Henry was alone with his food. "Don't worry, I'll feed you something," Henry said, dipping a piece of bread into the broth and giving it to the cat. The cat crept up to the bread and sniffed. "It's not fish this time, but beggars can't be choosers." The feline merely stared at him. He was about to talk to it again when the door opened, and in walked Baron Tostig. The Baron shook his cloak, and a few leaves drifted onto the floor. He was flanked on either side by two of his goons. When the Baron noticed Henry, a dangerous smile spread across his face.
"Chosen one, just the man I was looking for."
Henry said nothing. He was not in the mood for the Baron of Blackford. Then again, he never was. Ever since Henry had fallen out of favor with the Duke, Baron Tostig took endless delight in tormenting him.
"I have a mission for you," the Baron said. "It's happened again. Last night, 2 children went missing. It was the Newnham boys. They were last seen playing near the Svalich Wood. Dangerous place to be, especially during the full moon. Naturally, we suspect they were abducted by werewolves."
He picked at his fingernails with his teeth, spitting the torn pieces on Henry's table.
"Someone needs to find these children if they're still alive. Who better to do it than the Chosen One?"
It was a suicide mission. Anybody who went hunting for werewolves in the Svalich Wood was a fool looking for death. Henry cared about helping people in need, and he was willing to take risks. But the Baron singling him out reminded Henry that his life was not his own.
"Did you say werewolves?"
They all turned to see an elf a few tables away. She was dressed in the northern style, with an embroidered bodice, a short skirt, bright purple hose, and a matching cloak, like a bard from Firdar. A pseudo-dragon perched on her shoulder. It flapped its wings for balance as the elf jaunted over to the Baron. She held out her hand.
"Hello, I'm Navara. If you have werewolf problems, I'm your person."
The Baron hesitated, then shook her hand and introduced himself.
"When do you need someone to track them down?"
she asked.
"As soon as possible. I can have a 10 days' worth of provisions ready in the morning. Come by the manor at dawn. I also insist that someone local goes with you. If you're not from these parts, you'll need to be shown the way."
The Baron eyed Henry. The elf, Navara, and her dragon companion looked to Henry, too. "I'll go," Henry said, knowing he didn't really have a choice. The Baron rubbed his hands together.
It's settled, then. I'll see you both tomorrow, bright and early.
And without ordering anything from the bar, the Baron and his men left.
Wow, I didn't expect to go on a mission so soon. I'm Navara, by the way.
She held out her hand to Henry. Henry Gibson, he said, shaking it.
Pleasure to meet you.
She sat down at his table.
Sorry I was eavesdropping on your conversation. I hope I didn't just steal your job.
Not in the least. I'll be glad to have some company. But you're a stranger in town, and I must warn you that this will be very dangerous. In fact, we probably won't come out of it alive.
I can take care of myself, she said confidently. And it looks like you can too.
The elf pointed at his broadsword. Then she stared at Henry, tilting her head like a curious child. She pulled a journal from her pack and asked,
Can I draw a portrait of you? You just have such striking features. It reminds me of a fresco I saw of an angelic knight.
Are you trying to flirt with me? Henry asked. He wouldn't be surprised. Tall, dark, and remarkably handsome, Henry was accustomed to winks and furtive glances from blushing onlookers. Navara laughed.
Ah, flirting. I've heard of that. She tapped her nose. You'll have to forgive me. The sheriff back home says I'm too forward. He also says I have a lot to learn about the world. What was it he called me? Sheltered.
She patted her dragon.
But the past year I've spent all my time around humans. I think I've improved a lot. Obviously, I'm still learning. Anyway, enough about me. Is it still okay if I draw you?
Sure. He shrugged his shoulders. Navara's pencil began scribbling away.
So why did the Baron call you the Chosen One?
People started calling me that a while ago.
Why?
It began when I was 10 years old.
Go on.
He leaned back in his chair. Usually he would not want to share about himself with a stranger. But this elf's ignorance of his fame was a breath of fresh air. I was playing with some friends when we saw this. He gestured to the sword at his side. It was a forgotten curiosity, really. The sword was embedded in a rock about a mile north of here. It was stuck there for a long time, hundreds of years, they say. Nobody thought much of it. But there were old stories. My friends and I joked that we could pull it out. We each took turns and laughed all the while until it was my turn. I pulled it out.
Wow! What happened next?
It's not that exciting, really. It's just a regular sword. Decorative, but nothing extraordinary. Henry drew the weapon from its scabbard and placed it on the table in front of the elf. The blade was inlaid with a silver pattern, and a sunburst of lathander embellished the hilt. After I pulled it from the stone, my life became a piece of public property. Now everyone expects something from me. The truth is, I don't think the sword means anything. Navara's eyes went wide.
It must mean something.
That's what they all say.
Isn't there anything you've noticed that's special about you, or your connection with the sword?
Henry thought. It's probably just a coincidence, but one of the legends says that the sword will help its wielder find a lost valley. A few months after I pulled the sword, I found out about a county that no one else could remember except me. It was right there on the old maps, but no one had heard of it. Navara's jaw dropped, and she stopped sketching.
A lost valley, you say? Is this place in the Shadowfell?
I don't know anything about that, Henry said.
Do you remember what the place is called?
If I tell you, you'll just forget tomorrow.
It's Borovia, isn't it?
Navara leaned in. What? You know about Borovia? His eyes narrowed.
You know about Borovia?
She retorted. Henry nodded slowly.
But how? She asked. Are you a fae?
Nope, I'm human. But yes, I know about Borovia, which means I also know that nobody else can remember it. So how do you know? Navara clapped her hands together with glee.
My patron reminds me of it every morning. I'm going there, you see. Well, after I help you with the werewolves.
Henry shook his head in disbelief. Dr. Nellis is going to be thrilled that someone else knows about Borovia.
Henry Gibson, fate has brought us together.
Luck, more likely.
By the way, who's Dr. Nellis?
She's a professor at the Houses of Merlin.
Wow, you've been to the Houses of Merlin?
I studied there.
You are full of intrigue.
Navara hunched over her journal and began sketching.
You'll have to help me with some of my spells. I've been having trouble with flying.
Oh, I didn't learn any arcane magic there. I was sent to be educated by paladins.
Ah, okay. I've heard you can learn any subject at the houses.
Except necromancy. They have a strict no necromancy policy.
What about this Dr. Nellis?
Well, I met her at the houses, and once she found out what I could remember, she wanted me as her pupil. I ended up helping her part-time. You see, her sole job at that school was to study Borovia. One of the old headmasters, Mordenkainen, put her up to the task 200 years ago, or something like that. She's been at it ever since.
It can't be easy researching a place you can't remember,
Navara said. No, but she came up with a bunch of tricks to help her. Notes, mnemonic devices.
So you must know a lot about the Lost Valley.
Not really. Most of what we know is from 400 years ago. Even then, all we have are some old maps and court records. Navara's pencil made a broad scratching noise as she drew.
My patron told me that Blackfoot is the nearest town to Borovia. Would you know how to get there from here?
The pseudo-dragon, who had been looking from the journal to Henry, scrutinizing every line Navara drew, hopped to the floor and spotted the white cat. The dragon bobbed his head, fanned his ears out, and tiptoed toward the feline. He cautiously stretched out his neck to sniff, when the cat suddenly transformed into an elf. The dragon hissed and ran to its master. Henry's brow knitted as he looked up at the white-haired elf, confused and taken aback. He had been leaving fish for that cat outside his door every night for a 10-day. The elf's pale, teal-colored eyes gaped at them awkwardly.
Sorry to intrude, she said, but I need to speak with both of you.